I'm 55 now. I live in a quiet house in Oregon, far from the congregation I once called home. For years, I told myself I'd never speak publicly about what happened. I thought silence would protect me, from shame, from memories, from the eyes that once looked at me as if I were possessed. But silence only protects the guilty. What I'm about to share began 30 years ago, in 1995. Back then, I was 25, newly married, and deeply devoted to Jehovah's organization. I thought I knew what truth meant: obedience, loyalty, unquestioning faith. Until one Watchtower article changed everything. It was a Sunday morning, April 1995. I remember every detail of that day with the kind of clarity reserved for moments that divide your life into before and after. The Kingdom Hall smelled of old books and cheap perfume. Sister Martha always wore too much of that floral scent that made my nose itch. I remember the sunlight coming through the dusty blinds, creating stripes across the worn carpet, across the rows of metal folding chairs where we sat 3 times a week, absorbing teachings we weren't supposed to question. I was 25 years old. I'd been baptized at 16, married Daniel at 23, and spent every moment in between trying to be the perfect witness. I pioneered 60 hours a month, knocked on doors in the summer heat and winter rain, studied my Watchtower magazines with the diligence of a seminary student. I underlined passages, wrote notes in margins, prepared answers for meetings. I believed with the fervent certainty of someone who'd never been given permission to doubt. That morning, Brother Hill, a tall man with silver hair and a smile that never quite reached his eyes, handed me the new Watchtower as I walked into the hall. His wife had printed the copies the night before. I could still smell the toner. "This one's powerful, Sister Lawson," he said, his hand lingering on my shoulder just a moment too long. "You'll love it. Really speaks to the times we're living in." I thanked him and took my seat next to Daniel, who was already deep in conversation with Brother Kent about some ministerial servant responsibilities. Daniel barely acknowledged me. We'd only been married 2 years, but already I felt like a piece of furniture in his life, useful, necessary, but unremarkable. I opened the Watchtower and saw the article's title, "Guard Your Heart Against Independent Thinking." The phrase hit me oddly. Independent thinking. I read it 3 times, feeling something uncomfortable stir in my chest. I'd heard warnings about worldly thinking and satanic philosophy, but this was different. This was about thinking itself. As the meeting started and Brother Hill began reading the article aloud, I followed along, my finger tracing the words on the page. The article explained that independent thinking, forming your own conclusions, interpreting scripture without organizational guidance, was a form of pride. It compared questioning to Eve's original sin, suggesting that the desire to judge for yourself what is right and wrong was the same temptation that had caused humanity's fall. Even if we cannot fully understand a teaching, Brother Hill read, his voice carrying the weight of authority, our faith is shown by humble submission to Jehovah's channel of communication. My stomach tightened. I glanced around the room. Everyone was nodding, murmuring agreement. Sister Carol, my best friend, had her eyes closed in what looked like spiritual ecstasy. Daniel was taking notes, his expression serious and devoted. But I felt something else. A small, quiet voice in the back of my mind asking, why? The article continued, warning that Satan uses questions to plant doubt. That loyal Christians don't ask why, but rather, how can I better obey? It quoted scriptures about the dangers of leaning on your own understanding, about trusting in Jehovah rather than human wisdom. I underlined a sentence in red pencil, my hand trembling slightly. True humility is shown in full obedience to the guidance of the faithful and discreet slave. Something inside me snapped, not in rebellion, but in confusion. A crack in the foundation I'd built my entire adult life upon. I sat there, surrounded by 130 people, all nodding in agreement, and felt profoundly, terrifyingly alone. Because the question burning in my mind was this: if truth really came from God, if our teachings were really divine revelation, why would God fear questions? Why would an all-powerful, all-knowing creator be threatened by a finite human's attempt to understand? Wasn't faith supposed to include understanding? Hadn't Jesus encouraged people to reason, to examine, to search for truth? Hadn't the Bereans been praised in Acts for checking the scriptures to verify what they were being taught? I wanted to raise my hand. I wanted to ask these questions out loud. But I looked at the faces around me. Faces I'd known for years, people I loved and trusted, and I saw something that made me keep silent. They weren't just agreeing with the article. They were relieved by it. relieved to be told not to think, not to question, not to wrestle with complexity. The certainty was comfortable. The submission was safe. And I realized, sitting there in my modest dress with my underlined watchtower and my dutiful posture, that I'd just glimpsed something I wasn't supposed to see. A mechanism of control disguised as spiritual protection. The meeting ended. People stood, chatted, smiled. Daniel was already across the room, discussing the article enthusiastically with other brothers. Nobody noticed that I'd barely spoken, that I'd sat frozen in my chair for several minutes after the closing prayer. I drove home in silence. Daniel talked about how timely the article was, how Satan is really attacking people's faith these days with all that internet information. I nodded mechanically, my mind far away. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay next to Daniel in our small bedroom, listening to his steady breathing, listening to the rain hit the window. That particular Oregon rain that sounds like whispers, like secrets being shared in darkness. I stared at the ceiling and whispered prayers into the dark. Jehovah, please, help me understand why thinking is dangerous. Help me understand why asking questions feels like betrayal. Help me understand why I feel like I'm doing something wrong just by wondering. But the ceiling didn't answer. The rain kept falling. And somewhere deep inside me, a door had opened that I didn't know how to close. I didn't know it then, but that Sunday morning, that unremarkable April day with its dusty blinds and floral perfume, was the beginning of the end of the only life I'd ever known. A week later, on a Thursday evening just after sunset, there was a knock at our door. 3 deliberate raps that somehow sounded official, authoritative. Daniel and I were in the kitchen. I was washing dishes, he was reading the newspaper. We both froze. "Are you expecting someone?" I asked. Daniel's face had gone pale. "No. I don't know." But when he opened the door, I knew he'd been lying. The way his shoulders tensed, the way he stepped back without surprise, he'd known they were coming. 2 elders stood on our small porch, Brother Kent and Brother Hill. Brother Kent was the congregation's presiding overseer, a man in his late 50s with glasses that always seemed to be sliding down his nose. He wore a cheap suit that smelled faintly of mothballs. Brother Hill, the one who'd handed me that watchtower, stood slightly behind him, his expression grave. "Brothers," Daniel said, his voice cracking slightly. "Please come in." "Good evening, Brother Lawson," Brother Kent said, not smiling. "Sister Lawson, we apologize for dropping by unannounced. But we felt it important to have a word." My heart was pounding. I dried my hands on a dish towel, trying to appear calm, but my fingers were trembling. We all moved to the living room. That small, cramped space with its second-hand furniture and the picture of Paradise Earth hanging crookedly on the wall. They sat on the couch. Daniel and I sat across from them in mismatched chairs. The room suddenly felt tiny, airless. I could hear the wall clock ticking. Tick, 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 counting down to something I couldn't name but deeply feared. "Sister Lawson," Brother Kent began, adjusting his glasses and opening his worn Bible with practiced precision. "We've received some reports. Concerns, really, from various members of the congregation." My mouth went dry. "Concerns about what?" Brother Hill leaned forward, his hands clasped together. "About certain conversations you've been having. Questions you've been raising." "I haven't," I started, but Daniel interrupted. "She's been struggling," he said quickly, not looking at me, "with some of the deeper teachings. I've tried to help her, but—" I stared at him, betrayed. He'd discussed this with them without telling me? He'd reported his own wife? "I only had a question," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "About last week's Watchtower article. The one about independent thinking." I didn't understand why. Brother Kent cut me off, his voice sharp. "Sister Lawson, let me stop you right there. Do you know how Eve fell?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. She disobeyed God's command," I answered, my voice small. "And how did that disobedience begin?" Brother Hill prompted. With the serpent's question." "Exactly," Brother Kent said, his finger pointing at me as if I'd just confessed to a crime. "Satan didn't come to Eve with outright rebellion. He came with a simple question. Did God really say?" He planted doubt. He made her question what she knew to be true. I felt my face burning. "But I'm not questioning God. I'm trying to understand." "Understanding comes through submission," Brother Hill interrupted, his voice taking on that practiced tone elders use when counseling. "Not through independent reasoning. Sister, when we start questioning the faithful and discreet slave, we're questioning Jehovah's appointed channel. Do you see how dangerous that is?" Brother Kent opened his Bible to Proverbs. "Here." Proverbs 3 verses 5 to 6. Trust in Jehovah with all your heart, and do not lean on your own understanding. Do you see those words? Do not lean on your own understanding. That's not a suggestion, sister. That's a command. But how can I trust something I don't understand? The words came out before I could stop them. The room went silent. I could feel Daniel's horror radiating from beside me. Brother Kent's expression hardened. That, he said slowly, is exactly the attitude that concerns us. That question right there. That's the same spirit that led to Korah's rebellion in the wilderness. The same pride that caused Satan himself to question Jehovah's sovereignty. I'm not rebelling, I whispered, tears threatening. I'm just confused. Brother Hill softened slightly, but his words were no less cutting. Confusion is Satan's tool, sister. The truth is simple. Clear. When we feel confused, it's because we're entertaining thoughts we shouldn't. We're opening doors that should remain closed. They stayed for another hour. They read me scriptures about submission, about the dangers of apostasy, about how foolish and ignorant humans are compared to God's wisdom. They explained that my questions could stumble others, that even voicing doubt could plant seeds of rebellion in weaker minds. We've had reports, Brother Kent said, his voice taking on a warning tone, that you spoke with Sister Carol about these doubts. My heart sank. Carol had told them? My best friend had reported our private conversation? We weren't, I began. It doesn't matter what you intended, Brother Hill said. What matters is the effect. Sister Carol came to us disturbed, confused. Your words affected her faith. That makes you a stumbling block. Before they left, Brother Kent delivered his final judgment. Sister Lawson, until you can demonstrate a more submissive spirit, we're asking that you refrain from commenting at meetings. You need time to work on your heart condition. Time to study and pray. Time to remember your place in Jehovah's organization. My place. As if I were property to be positioned, not a person seeking truth. They prayed before they left, a long, pointed prayer asking Jehovah to soften Sister Lawson's rebellious heart and to help her see the danger of prideful thinking. I sat there with my head bowed, tears streaming silently down my face, while they asked God to fix what was broken in me. After they left, Daniel wouldn't look at me. He picked up his newspaper, shook it open, and sat back down as if nothing had happened. You told them? I asked, my voice hollow. You were talking to Carol. You were spreading doubt. What was I supposed to do? You were supposed to be my husband. He finally looked up, and his eyes were cold. I'm a Christian first. Your husband second. You need to get your priorities straight, Rebecca. I went to our bedroom and closed the door. I sat on the edge of our bed, the bed we'd shared for 2 years, where we'd whispered dreams and promises, and I understood something devastating. I was completely alone. 2 days later, at the Thursday night meeting, I sat in my usual seat and remained silent. When the question and answer portion of the Watchtower study came, I kept my hand down. Sisters who usually smiled at me looked away. Brothers who used to greet me warmly gave curt nods. I had been marked. Not officially disfellowshipped, not publicly reproved. Just silenced. And in that silence, I began to understand what the organization truly was. Not a family, but a system. And in that system, questioning wasn't a path to truth. It was a crime. The following Thursday night, I arrived at the Kingdom Hall with my stomach in knots. Daniel had driven separately, claiming he needed to arrive early for ministerial duties. Really, he just didn't want to be seen with me. I walked in alone, clutching my Bible and Watchtower magazine like shields. The hall was already filling up. Families settling into their usual spots, friends chatting in clusters, children running between chairs until their parents shushed them. I took my seat in the third row, where I'd always sat. Sister Martha usually saved the seat next to me for Carol. But tonight, Sister Martha had her purse in that spot, and when I approached, she suddenly became very interested in her magazine. Is this seat taken? I asked quietly. She glanced up, and I saw something in her eyes I'd never seen before, fear. Fear of me. Oh, Sister Lawson. I'm sorry, I'm saving it for someone. She looked away quickly. I moved down the row. Every seat I approached suddenly became occupied or saved. Finally, I sat in the back corner, alone, where people usually only sat when they arrived late. The meeting started. Brother Hill walked to the podium, adjusted the microphone, and opened with a prayer. Then he made an announcement that made my blood run cold. Brothers and sisters, before we begin tonight's program, the body of elders felt it necessary to address a matter affecting our congregation's spiritual health. He paused, his eyes scanning the audience. I felt like everyone could see through me, like I was transparent with guilt. Certain ones, he continued, his voice carrying that tone of grave concern, have been counseled recently for promoting spiritually harmful conversations, for raising questions that serve not to build faith, but to tear it down, for allowing independent thinking, that tool of Satan, to take root in their hearts and spread to others. My face burned. My hands gripped my Bible so hard my knuckles turned white. We want to remind everyone of the Apostle Paul's words to Timothy. Reject foolish and ignorant debates, knowing they produce fights. We must guard our associations wisely. We must be careful not to be influenced by those who claim to be seeking truth, but are actually sowing discord. He didn't say my name. He didn't have to. After the announcement, the meeting continued as normal. We studied the Watchtower article. Ironically, it was about loving your brothers and sisters in the congregation, about being a warm, welcoming spiritual family. I sat in my corner seat, tears blurring the words on the page, while the congregation discussed how important it was to show love and support to one another. When the meeting ended, the isolation became physical. People formed their usual social groups, clusters of conversation in the aisles, in the parking lot, by the literature counter. I stood up, gathered my things, and tried to leave quietly. But I had to pass through the main aisle, had to walk through the crowd. Sisters I'd studied with for years turned their backs as I approached. Brother Anderson, who'd once told me I was a fine example for the young ones, looked right through me as if I didn't exist. A group of teenagers I'd taught in Bible study actually stopped their conversation mid-sentence when I walked by, their eyes following me with mixture of curiosity and judgment. I saw Carol across the room. She was talking with Sister Martha and another sister, laughing about something. I walked toward her, desperate for even a small gesture of solidarity. "Carol," I said softly. She looked at me, and for a moment, I saw conflict in her eyes. But then Sister Martha touched her arm, said something I couldn't hear, and Carol's expression hardened. "I have to go," Carol said, not to me but to the air around me. She walked past, and the other sisters followed, leaving me standing alone in the middle of the Kingdom Hall. I made it to my car before the tears came. I sat in the driver's seat in the dark parking lot, watching through blurred vision as families laughed and hugged goodbye, as children played tag between cars, as my entire community, everyone I'd ever known, everyone I'd ever loved, went on with their lives as if I'd ceased to exist. Daniel didn't come home until after midnight. I heard him stumble in, heard him make himself food in the kitchen, heard him settle on the couch. He didn't check on me, didn't ask if I was okay. The weeks that followed were a masterclass in social annihilation. At the meetings I forced myself to attend, I sat alone. In field service, no one offered to be my partner. When I tried to join conversations after meetings, people would suddenly remember they needed to be somewhere else. Sister Carol, the woman who'd been my best friend since we were teenagers, who'd been my maid of honor, who'd cried on my shoulder when her father died, walked past me in the Safeway parking lot one afternoon. I called her name. She looked right at me, then got in her car and drove away. I started having panic attacks before meetings. My chest would tighten, my breath would come in short gasps, and I'd have to grip the steering wheel and remind myself to breathe. Sometimes I'd sit in the parking lot for 20 minutes, gathering the courage to walk inside and face another evening of being invisible. Daniel grew more distant by the day. He started sleeping on the couch, claiming I snored, or he needed to study late. Really, he just couldn't bear to be near me. At meetings, he'd sit with the other ministerial servants, and when people asked about me, I'd see him shake his head sadly, playing the part of the long-suffering husband dealing with a spiritually weak wife. One evening, about 6 weeks after the elder's visit, I looked in the mirror while getting ready for another meeting. The woman staring back at me was unrecognizable. Dark circles under her eyes. Weight loss that made her clothes hang loose. A hollowness in her expression that looked like someone who'd been slowly erased. I whispered to my reflection, maybe they're right. Maybe I am sick. Maybe there really is something wrong with me. But even as I said it, even as I tried to make myself believe it, that small voice, the one that had asked why, when I read that Watchtower article, whispered back, "This isn't God. This is cruelty dressed up as righteousness." That night at the meeting, I sat in my corner seat and watched the congregation sing kingdom songs about love and unity. I watched them smile and hug and call each other brother and sister. I watched them preach about Jehovah's loving organization. And I understood, with devastating clarity, that love given conditionally isn't love at all. It's obedience masquerading as affection. It's a transaction. Behave correctly, believe correctly, speak correctly, and you'll be embraced. Deviate in any way, and you'll be discarded. I was learning that the organization's definition of family was this: we'll love you as long as you never question, never doubt, never think outside the boundaries we've established. The moment you do, you're not a person struggling with faith. You're a threat to be neutralized. Deep down, beneath the shame and fear, something sacred was being violated. The fundamental right to think, to seek truth, to breathe without fear of punishment. I didn't know it yet, but that violation would eventually become my liberation. First, though, I had to break completely. By August, 3 months after that initial question, I couldn't bear the meetings anymore. Every talk sounded like a warning directed at me. Every Watchtower paragraph felt like an indictment. The songs about paradise felt like mockery. Promises of a future where I'd be destroyed for the crime of wondering why. I started having nightmares. In them, I'd be standing at Armageddon, watching from a distance as my family and friends walked into paradise while I burned. Or I'd be at a judicial committee, and the elders would have my thoughts written down in a book, every question I'd ever had listed as evidence of my apostasy. I'd wake up gasping, my heart racing, Daniel's steady breathing beside me a reminder that he slept peacefully while I drowned. One afternoon in late August, Daniel came home from a meeting with the service overseer. I was in the kitchen, trying to force myself to eat something. I'd lost 15 pounds, and my clothes hung off my frame like I was disappearing. The door slammed. I flinched. Daniel stormed into the kitchen, his face red, his jaw clenched. He threw his meeting bag onto the counter so hard that his Bible and notebooks spilled out. "The elders want to meet with you again," he said, his voice shaking with anger. "Brother Kent says you're becoming a problem. A serious problem." I set down my fork, my appetite completely gone. I haven't said anything to anyone. I've been silent at every meeting. You don't have to say anything," he shouted. "Your attitude is enough. The way you sit there, distant, not participating. Everyone can see you're not." He searched for the word. "You're not submissive. You're embarrassing me, Rebecca." Something in me shifted. For months, I'd been swallowing my questions, my doubts, my pain. I'd been trying to make myself smaller, quieter, less problematic. But in that moment, hearing Daniel, my husband, the man who'd promised to love me, tell me I was an embarrassment, something broke. "Do you even hear yourself?" I asked, my voice eerily calm. "You're angry because I read. You're upset because I think. When did that become a crime? When did asking questions become worse than lying, worse than cruelty, worse than abuse?" His expression hardened. "This is exactly what they warned me about. This is apostate thinking." "What's apostate about wanting to understand?" "You're not trying to understand. You're trying to justify rebellion." I stood up, and I felt taller than I had in months. "I'm trying to figure out why an organization that claims to love me treats me like a disease for having questions. I'm trying to understand why you reported your own wife to elders instead of talking to me. I'm trying to figure out when submission became more important than truth." Daniel stared at me, and I saw something in his eyes I'd never seen before. Not just anger, but fear. He was afraid of me. Afraid that my doubt might be contagious, that my questions might infect him, that my independent thinking might destroy his perfect record in the organization. "I'm done," he said quietly. "I'm done trying to help you. If you want to throw away your relationship with Jehovah, fine. But you're not taking me down with you." He grabbed his car keys and left. The door slammed again, and I heard his car peel out of the driveway. He didn't come back that night. Or the next. He stayed with his parents, and when he finally returned 3 days later, it was only to pack a bag. "Where are you going?" I asked. "Brother Anderson has a spare room. I'll stay there until you come to your senses." Or until. He didn't finish the sentence, but I knew what he meant. "Until the elders disfellowship you. Until I can file for divorce on scriptural grounds. Until you're no longer my problem." That weekend, on a Sunday morning, Brother Kent and 2 other elders came to the house. I'd been expecting them. I'd spent the previous 3 days in a strange, calm clarity, the kind that comes when you've already decided to stop fighting. They didn't knock. They had Daniel's key. I was sitting at the kitchen table in my pajamas, drinking cold coffee when they walked in. "Sister Lawson," Brother Kent said, and his voice had that tone. The one elders use when they're done being patient. "We need to talk." They sat at my kitchen table, in my house, uninvited, and proceeded to read me scriptures. About rebellion. About Korah and his followers being swallowed by the earth. About Ananias and Sapphira being struck dead for lying to the Holy Spirit. About disfellowshipping being necessary to keep the congregation clean. We've been patient, Brother Hill said. We've tried to help you. But you're not showing any signs of repentance. Repentance for what? I asked. For having questions? For not being able to turn off my brain. For your attitude, Brother Kent said sharply. For your proud spirit. For your unwillingness to submit to Jehovah's organization. The third elder, Brother Morrison, a man I'd barely interacted with, opened his Bible to a scripture about demons. Sister, we're concerned that you may be under spiritual attack. That Satan has gained a foothold in your mind. You think I'm possessed? I almost laughed, except it wasn't funny. We think, Brother Kent said carefully, that you've opened yourself up to demonic influence by entertaining apostate thinking. We'd like to pray over you. They didn't ask permission. They just started. The three of them formed a circle around my kitchen table, placed their hands on my shoulders and head, and began to pray. The prayer was long, aggressive, demanding. They prayed for Jehovah to cast out whatever darkness had entered me. They prayed for my rebellious spirit to be broken. They prayed for me to return to the truth before it's too late. I sat there, trapped under their hands, listening to them treat me like something possessed, something unclean, something that needed to be exorcised rather than understood. When they finally finished and left, I sat at that table for hours. The sun moved across the floor. The house settled around me with its empty sounds. The coffee in my cup grew room temperature, then cool. I stared at my open Bible, the one Daniel had given me when we got married, with my name embossed in gold letters on the cover. I'd underlined hundreds of verses, written countless notes in the margins, memorized chapters. And I realized I didn't recognize the God in this book. The God I'd been taught about, the one who valued obedience over love, silence over seeking, submission over understanding, wasn't the God I'd been praying to in my private moments. The organization had created a God in its own image, authoritarian, controlling, punitive. A God who required absolute obedience and offered only conditional love. A God who feared questions because questions threatened his authority. But that wasn't God. That was just men using God's name to justify their control. Something broke that night. Not my faith in God, but my faith in the organization. The two things I'd been taught were inseparable suddenly split apart, and I saw clearly what I'd been too afraid to see before. The organization wasn't protecting me from Satan. It was the very thing I needed protection from. I closed the Bible and put it in a drawer. I couldn't throw it away, too much conditioning, too much ingrained fear. But I couldn't look at it either. Not yet. Not while its pages still echoed with the voices of men who'd used it as a weapon against my soul. I went to bed that night, alone in a house that felt haunted by the ghost of my former self. And I didn't pray. For the first time in my adult life, I didn't ask Jehovah for anything. Because I was starting to suspect that whoever had been listening to my prayers all these years, it wasn't the God of love I'd been promised. It was just the echo of my own desperate hope, bouncing back empty. September came with unexpected rain and an emptiness that filled every room of our small house. Daniel and I barely spoke anymore. He slept on the couch most nights, and I pretended not to care. The congregation had become a theater where I performed obedience while my soul screamed in silence. One Tuesday afternoon, I drove to Portland. I told Daniel I needed groceries, but that was a lie. I needed to breathe air that didn't taste like judgment. I parked near Powell's Books, that massive cathedral of literature on Burnside Street. I had never been inside. We were discouraged from visiting worldly bookstores, places where apostate material might contaminate our thinking. But that day, I didn't care about rules. I walked through those doors like someone crossing into forbidden territory, my heart pounding with equal parts fear and exhilaration. The store smelled of old paper and coffee. I wandered the aisles aimlessly, touching book spines, reading titles I'd never heard of. Philosophy, psychology, comparative religion, words I'd been taught to avoid. And then I saw it, on a shelf labeled Religious Studies, wedged between volumes on Buddhism and Mormonism, was a blue paperback. The title stopped my breath. Crisis of Conscience by Raymond Franz. I knew that name. Every witness did. Raymond Franz had been a member of the governing body, the very heart of the organization, before he was disfellowshipped in 1981. We were told he was an apostate, a traitor, someone who had fallen away from truth out of pride and bitterness. We were warned never to read his writings, never to speak his name except in cautionary tales. My hand trembled as I reached for the book. I looked around, paranoid, as if elders might materialize from the stacks to catch me in the act. But the store was quiet, filled only with strangers who didn't care what I read. I opened to a random page. The words hit me like a physical blow. I could not in good conscience continue to represent the organization as God's sole channel of truth, when I had seen the inner workings, the politics, the manipulation of Scripture to maintain authority. My eyes blurred with tears. Someone understood. Someone who had been higher than any elder, higher than any circuit overseer, someone who had sat in the rooms where doctrine was written. And he had questions too. I bought the book with cash. I hid it in my purse under grocery receipts and old tissues, my hands shaking as I walked back to my car. I felt like a criminal, like I'd just purchased something obscene. That night, after Daniel fell asleep on the couch, I locked myself in the bathroom and read by the dim light over the sink. I sat on the cold tile floor, my back against the bathtub, and I devoured page after page. Franz wrote about meetings where governing body members argued over interpretations, where decisions were made not by divine revelation, but by majority vote. He described how dissent was crushed, how questions were treated as threats, how people's lives were controlled through fear disguised as love. I read about the 1975 prophecy, the prediction that Armageddon would come that year, a teaching that destroyed families and lives when it failed. The organization later denied they'd ever made such claims, blamed the members for misunderstanding, and moved on without apology. I read about blood transfusions, about people dying because of a policy that had changed multiple times over the decades, about the cover-ups, the judicial committees that protected abusers while silencing victims. Every page confirmed what I'd felt but couldn't articulate. I wasn't crazy. The doubts weren't demons. The questions weren't sin. I cried until my chest hurt. Not from sadness, but from something more complex, relief mixed with grief, liberation tangled with loss. Everything I'd built my identity on was crumbling, and I didn't know if I was being destroyed or set free. By dawn, I'd read half the book. I hid it behind the water heater in the basement, wrapped in a plastic bag. Over the next 2 weeks, I returned to that hiding spot whenever I could, reading in stolen moments when Daniel was at work or at the Kingdom Hall. But reading wasn't enough. I needed more. I needed to know I wasn't alone. One evening, as I was replacing the book behind the water heater, I noticed an address printed in the back pages. A contact address for an organization called Free Minds Incorporated. They helped ex-Jehovah's Witnesses transition out of the religion, provided support, connected people with similar experiences. I stared at that address for a long time. Contacting them would be crossing a line I couldn't uncross. It would mean admitting, even to myself, that I was considering leaving. But hadn't I already crossed that line the moment I bought the book? The next day, I drove to a post office 3 towns over. I wrote a letter on plain paper, using a fake name, Sarah Miller, because I was still too afraid to be Rebecca Lawson, the woman who questioned. Dear Free Minds, I wrote, I don't know if I believe anymore. I don't know what I believe. But I know I need help. I know I can't be the only one who feels this way. Please tell me I'm not alone. I mailed it before I could change my mind. 3 weeks later, a package arrived. Daniel was at work. I opened it with shaking hands. Inside were photocopied testimonies, dozens of them, from people who had left the organization. There were letters from former elders, pioneers, Bethel workers. Stories of families torn apart, of decades lost, of children shunned by their own parents. But also stories of healing, of finding authentic faith, of learning to think without fear. One testimony was from a woman named Margaret. She had been disfellowshipped for asking questions about the UN scandal. When it was discovered that the Watchtower had been secretly affiliated with the United Nations, the very beast they had taught was Satan's organization. She wrote, They called me an apostate for wanting truth. But all I wanted was honesty. If we really had the truth, why did it need to be protected by lies? I read every testimony that day. And then I read them again. Each story felt like a mirror reflecting pieces of my own experience. The isolation, the gaslighting, the crushing weight of trying to make sense of contradictions while being told that questioning itself was the problem. That night I made a decision. If these people had the courage to tell their stories, then maybe I could too. Maybe I could help someone else the way these testimonies had helped me. Maybe there were others in my congregation, or in kingdom halls across the country, who were suffering in silence, thinking they were the only ones who felt this way. I started keeping a journal. I documented everything. The dates of my conversations with elders, the exact words they'd used, the way I'd been treated. I wrote down my own testimony, from the moment I'd read that Watchtower article to this moment of awakening. But I couldn't just write for myself. I needed to collect other stories. I needed evidence that this wasn't isolated, that the system itself was broken. And so, I began my secret mission. The project started small. I began with Carol, my former best friend who had stopped speaking to me after the elders' announcement. I wrote her a letter, not confrontational, just vulnerable. I told her I missed her. I asked if she'd ever felt afraid to question things. I never expected a response. So when I found a note tucked under my windshield wiper after the Thursday meeting, my heart nearly stopped. Rebecca, meet me at the Safeway parking lot tomorrow at 2 p.m. Come alone. Don't tell anyone. See. The next day, I found Carol sitting in her car, windows up, eyes red from crying. She was clutching a Watchtower magazine so hard it was crumpled. Get in, she said. I slid into the passenger seat. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Carol's voice broke. I thought I was going crazy. I thought Satan had gotten into my head. She told me everything. About how her teenage son had asked questions about dinosaurs and the creation account. Questions that made sense, but that she was told not to entertain. About how the elders counseled her to limit his access to science books. About how he'd become depressed, withdrawn, angry. They said I was spiritually weak because I couldn't control my son, she whispered. But Rebecca, he's not doing anything wrong. He's just thinking. Why is that a crime? I held her hand and told her what I'd learned. About Raymond Franz. About the testimonies. About the fact that we weren't alone, that questioning didn't make us evil or possessed. Carol cried harder. I want out, she said. But if I leave, I lose everything. My parents won't speak to me. My sister will shun me. Even my husband. He's so deep in the organization, I don't know if he'd choose me or them. I understood. The organization had designed the perfect trap. Surround people with conditional love, make their entire social world dependent on obedience, then threaten total abandonment if they leave. It wasn't just a religion, it was a hostage situation. Write it down, I told her. Everything you're feeling, everything that's happened. Write it as if you're telling someone who needs to know they're not alone. Who would I be writing to? Someone like us. Someone who's sitting in a kingdom hall, right now feeling crazy. Someone who thinks they're the only one. Carol wrote her testimony that night. She gave it to me in a sealed envelope 3 days later, her hands shaking. If anyone finds out I wrote this, I'm done. My family, my life, everything. I'll protect it, I promised. No names unless you want them. Just your truth. That was the first testimony I collected. But it wouldn't be the last. Over the next 6 months, I discovered a network of doubt hidden beneath the surface of our congregation. People who smiled and nodded during meetings, but privately wrestled with questions they couldn't voice. I learned to recognize them. The ones whose eyes looked tired during talks, who hesitated just a second too long when praising the organization, who seemed relieved when meetings ended. I developed a system. I would write short, carefully worded notes and leave them in bathroom stalls at the Kingdom Hall, tucked into Watchtower magazines, slipped into coat pockets. The notes never said anything explicit, just, if you have questions you're afraid to ask, write to P.O. Box 847, Salem, Oregon. You're not alone. I'd rented the P.O. box under my maiden name, told Daniel it was for a side business selling crafts. He barely noticed. We were living parallel lives by then, 2 strangers occupying the same house. Letters started arriving. At first, just a few. Then more. Then dozens. They came from all over Oregon, then from Washington, California, even as far as Texas. People who had somehow heard about the P.O. box through whisper networks, through someone who knew someone who had questions. I read every letter. Some were angry. Some were heartbroken. Many were terrified. A man named David wrote about being disfellowshipped because he reported an elder for molesting his daughter. The elders said there weren't 2 witnesses to the abuse, so no action could be taken against the elder. But when David went to the police, they disfellowshipped him for bringing reproach on Jehovah's organization. They protected a pedophile and punished me for protecting my child, he wrote. How is that God's organization? A woman named Jennifer described pioneering for 20 years, sacrificing education and career to serve the organization. When she developed chronic illness and could no longer meet her hour requirements, she was dropped from pioneer status and suddenly found herself ignored by the congregation. I gave them my whole life, she wrote. And the moment I couldn't give any more, I became invisible. An elder named Thomas, still serving, still pretending, wrote about the judicial committees he'd sat on. We're not trained counselors or therapists, he wrote. We're janitors and plumbers playing God with people's lives. I've watched marriages destroyed, families shattered, people driven to suicide, all because 3 men in a backroom decided they weren't repentant enough. I don't know how to keep doing this. Each testimony broke my heart and strengthened my resolve. I organized them by theme: shunning, abuse, blood policy, false prophecies, mental health, control tactics. I created a filing system in locked boxes hidden in the crawl space under our house. Daniel never suspected. He was too consumed with his own position in the congregation, working his way toward becoming a ministerial servant. The irony wasn't lost on me. While he climbed the organizational ladder, I was documenting why that ladder needed to be torn down. But collecting testimonies wasn't enough. I needed to do something with them. I needed to make them matter. In 1997, I made contact with a journalist named Ellen Price who had written an article about religious freedom for a Portland newspaper. I sent her copies of 5 testimonies, with all identifying information removed, and a cover letter explaining the pattern of abuse and control. She called me 2 weeks later. We met at a coffee shop in Eugene, 2 hours from Salem. I was so nervous I could barely hold my cup. These stories are devastating, Ellen said. But to publish anything, I need verifiable facts. I need people willing to go on record. Otherwise, it's hearsay. My heart sank. These people can't go public. They'll lose their families. Some still have children in the organization. I understand, Ellen said gently. But journalism requires evidence. Names, dates, documents. I left that meeting feeling defeated. The truth was trapped, held hostage by the same fear that kept people silent. But then something unexpected happened. Living between truth and fear is like drowning in slow motion. You learn to hold your breath, to smile while your lungs scream for air, to function while suffocating. For years, nearly 2 decades, that was my existence. By 1999, I had collected over 300 testimonies. I kept them in waterproof boxes, cataloged and coded, hidden in the crawl space under our house. I told Daniel I was using the space for craft storage. He never looked. I attended meetings every week, went door to door on Saturdays, smiled at sisters who had once been my friends. I was a ghost in a kingdom hall full of ghosts. All of us performing, pretending, hiding our questions behind makeup and modest dresses. But I wasn't passive. I was strategic. I learned to identify the vulnerable ones, the questioners, the ones drowning like me. A young mother who looked panicked during talks about not pursuing higher education. A teenage boy whose eyes filled with shame during discussions about homosexuality. An elderly woman whose daughter had been disfellowshipped and shunned. I would approach them carefully, never at the Kingdom Hall, always in neutral spaces. The grocery store. The park. The public library. I'd start with casual conversation, then slowly, carefully, offer them something. If you ever need someone to talk to, someone who won't judge. I'd slip them a card with my P.O. box address. Some threw the cards away. Some reported me to elders, though without proof of what I was doing, they could only watch me suspiciously. But some wrote letters. And those letters kept me going. My marriage to Daniel deteriorated beyond repair. By 2002, we were strangers sharing a house. He had become a ministerial servant by then, completely absorbed in organizational duties. He gave talks, led field service groups, attended elders' meetings as a guest. Meanwhile, I was the wife who had spiritual weakness, the embarrassing footnote in his otherwise exemplary service record. We divorced in 2004. It was shockingly civil. He wanted out as much as I did. The congregation was told I had emotional problems, and that Daniel had tried everything to help me. Nobody questioned it. Troubled wives were common. Questioning husbands were rare. After the divorce, I moved to a small rental house on the outskirts of Salem. I stopped attending meetings regularly, which meant I was marked as spiritually inactive. My family, my parents, my younger brother, began the slow process of shunning me. Not officially disfellowshipped, just forgotten. But in that forgetting, I found freedom. Without the constant surveillance of congregational life, I could work more openly. I expanded my network. I connected with other ex-JW activists, people running websites, support groups, hotlines. I learned about the larger movement of people trying to expose the organization's failures. I attended my first XJW convention in 2005, held in San Diego. Walking into that hotel conference room felt like stepping into another dimension. Hundreds of people, former elders, pioneers, Bethelites, all gathered to share stories, to heal, to strategize. I met a man named Rick there, a former elder who had left after discovering the two-witness rule had protected multiple child abusers in his congregation. He had spent years collecting court documents, police reports, news articles, building a database of abuse cases connected to Jehovah's Witnesses. "Your testimonies," he said when I told him about my collection, "combined with my legal documentation, we could create something powerful. Evidence that this isn't isolated incidents. This is systemic." We became partners. Over the next 5 years, we built what we called the Archive, a comprehensive collection of documented cases, testimonies, policy letters, internal memos that had been leaked by active witnesses who were secretly opposed to organizational practices. We created a website in 2007. Nothing flashy, just a simple page with a mission statement and a contact form. Within 6 months, we were receiving hundreds of emails. People sharing their stories, asking for help, looking for resources to leave safely. Some emails broke me, like the one from Amanda, a 16-year-old girl who wrote, "My parents won't let me go to college. They say Armageddon is coming soon, and I should pioneer instead. I want to be a doctor. Is that wrong? Is wanting an education a sin?" Or the one from Marcus, "I'm gay. I've prayed every day for Jehovah to fix me. I've talked to elders, fasted, studied extra. Nothing changes. Now they're pressuring me to get baptized. If I do, and they find out about me, I'll be disfellowshipped. But if I don't, my family will think I'm refusing God. I don't know how to stay alive." I answered every email personally. I couldn't save everyone, couldn't fix everything, but I could offer what had saved me. The knowledge that they weren't alone, that their questions were valid, that their pain was real. But maintaining 2 lives was exhausting. I worked a regular job at a medical office to pay bills. I attended occasional meetings to maintain minimal contact with my family. And every evening, every weekend, I worked on the archive, responding to emails, collecting testimonies, updating the website. I was exhausted, but I couldn't stop, because for every person who found the archive, there were thousands still trapped, still suffering, still believing they were the problem. By 2010, I had been living this double life for 15 years. The weight of it was crushing. I was 40 years old, unmarried, estranged from my family, with no children, no conventional success. Some days I wondered if I'd wasted my life on a mission that wouldn't change anything. Then I got an email that changed everything. It was from a woman named Patricia. She had left the organization 5 years earlier after her husband died because he refused a blood transfusion. She'd been trying to sue the organization for wrongful death, but her lawyers said the religious freedom protections made it nearly impossible. "I know you collect testimonies," she wrote, "but testimonies aren't enough anymore. We need legal action. We need investigations. We need the authorities to see what's happening." She was right. After 15 years of collecting stories, I had a mountain of evidence. But evidence buried in boxes under my house didn't help anyone. It was time to go public. The decision to expose everything didn't come with dramatic fanfare. It came quietly, on an ordinary Tuesday morning in March 2012, as I sat at my kitchen table staring at 17 years' worth of collected pain. 347 testimonies, 82 documented cases of abuse, leaked internal documents showing how elders were instructed to handle misconduct, court records, hospital reports, suicide notes. I called Rick. "I think it's time," I said. "I think we need to take this to journalists. Real journalists. National media." There was a long pause. "Rebecca, you know what this means. They'll come after you. They'll try to discredit you. Your family will completely cut you off." "They already have," I said. "I've been living half dead for 17 years, Rick. I'm tired of hiding. These people trusted me with their stories. I need to honor that trust." We spent 3 months preparing. We organized the testimonies thematically, created timelines, verified every fact we could. We reached out to attorneys who specialized in religious organization cases. We compiled a media packet that was undeniable in its thoroughness. In June 2012, we contacted Rachel Morris, an investigative journalist with The Atlantic who had written extensively about religious abuse. We sent her everything. She called us a week later. "I want to do this story," she said. "But I need people willing to go on record. Real names. Real faces." This was the moment I'd been dreading. Asking people to step out of anonymity, to risk everything for a story that might change nothing. I sent an email to everyone in my network, hundreds of people I'd been in contact with over the years. I told them about the article, about the opportunity to finally be heard. I made it clear, no pressure, no judgment if they couldn't do it. 43 people responded yes. 43 people willing to attach their names and faces to their stories. Former elders, abuse survivors, people who had lost children to the blood policy, parents shunned by their own kids, people who had given decades to the organization only to be discarded when they asked questions. Rachel interviewed each of them. She spent 6 months researching, fact-checking, building an airtight case. And in December 2012, The Atlantic published The Kingdom's Secrets, Inside the Hidden World of Jehovah's Witnesses. The article was devastating. It detailed everything. The abuse cover-ups, the harmful medical policies, the destructive shunning practices, the psychological control tactics. It included my testimony, my real name, my face. The response was overwhelming. The article went viral. News outlets around the world picked it up. Suddenly, ex-Jehovah's Witnesses were appearing on talk shows, news panels, radio programs. The organization issued official statements denying everything, calling it apostate lies and persecution. But the evidence was irrefutable. Court cases began surfacing. More journalists started investigating. Documentaries were produced. Governments started asking questions about the organization's handling of abuse cases. And I was at the center of it all. My phone rang constantly. Journalists wanting interviews. People thanking me for speaking up. Lawyers asking me to testify in cases. But also threats. Anonymous messages calling me Satan's tool, promising I would die at Armageddon, saying I'd destroyed families. My parents sent me a letter. 3 sentences long. "You have brought reproach on Jehovah's name. You are no longer our daughter. Do not contact us again." I read it once, then put it in a drawer. I'd grieved that relationship years ago. This was just the official death certificate. But something else happened too, something I hadn't expected. People started leaving. Not just individuals here and there, but families, entire congregations worth of people who finally had permission to question, to leave, to save themselves. I received thousands of emails. People saying the article had saved their lives, that they'd been planning suicide before they read it, that they'd felt insane until they saw their experience reflected in others' stories. A woman named Sarah wrote, "I've been out for 3 years, shunned by everyone I ever loved. I thought I was being punished by God. Your article made me realize I wasn't escaping punishment. I was escaping prison. Thank you for helping me breathe again." In 2015, 3 years after the article, I finally dismantled my P.O. box. I didn't need it anymore. People could contact me directly now. I had nothing left to hide. I started speaking publicly. I gave talks at universities about religious control and mind manipulation. I testified in court cases involving Jehovah's Witnesses. I consulted with lawyers working on abuse cases. I became the person I'd needed when I was 25 and terrified. Rick and I expanded the archive into a full resource center. We created guides for people leaving the organization, how to build a support system, how to handle shunning, how to deconstruct indoctrination. We connected people with therapists who specialized in religious trauma. We helped families torn apart by shunning find ways to maintain contact. By 2018, I had been out of the organization for over a decade. I'd spent my 40s fighting battles I'd started in my 20s. I was tired. Proud but tired. I met someone. His name was Michael, a kind man who'd left Mormonism decades ago and understood religious trauma without me having to explain. We married in 2019, in a simple ceremony in my backyard with a dozen ex-JW friends in attendance. No elders to approve. No organizational rules about who could attend. Just people who chose to love me, not because they were required to, but because they wanted to. My mother died in 2020. I found out through a cousin who'd also left the organization. I wasn't invited to the funeral. I wasn't even told when it happened. According to my family, I was already dead. I grieved her loss the way I'd grieved everything the organization had taken. Deeply, privately, without the comfort of the people who should have held me. But I wasn't alone. I had Michael. I had Rick and the dozens of activists who'd become my chosen family. I had thousands of people who'd reached out over the years to say I'd helped save their lives. That had to be enough. It was enough. Now, at 55, I live quietly in Oregon with Michael and 2 rescue dogs. I still run the archive, though I've trained others to take over the day-to-day work. I still speak occasionally, still testify in court when asked. But mostly, I've learned to rest. Last month, I received an email from a young woman named Emily. She'd just left the organization at 23, had been shunned by her entire family, and was terrified of the world outside Kingdom Halls. "I don't know how to live," she wrote. "They taught me the world was evil, that I'd fail without Jehovah's organization. What if they're right? What if I've made a terrible mistake?" I wrote back immediately. "Dear Emily, you haven't made a mistake. You've made a choice to live authentically. That's terrifying, but it's also sacred. The world isn't perfect, but it's real. And real is better than the artificial paradise they promised while slowly suffocating you. You will stumble. You will doubt yourself. Some days you'll miss the certainty, even if that certainty was a cage. But I promise you this. Every day you choose truth over comfortable lies, you become more yourself. And that self is worth fighting for. You're not alone. You never were. Welcome to freedom." I hit send and looked out my window at the Oregon rain. The same rain I'd listened to 30 years ago while lying next to Daniel and whispering desperate prayers. That Rebecca, young, terrified, convinced her questions made her evil. She couldn't have imagined this life. The cost had been enormous. I'd lost my family, my community, years of my life. I'd carried the weight of hundreds of people's trauma alongside my own. But I'd also gained something irreplaceable, myself. The real Rebecca, not the performance the organization demanded. The Rebecca who questions, who thinks, who refuses to accept cruelty disguised as love. The Rebecca who turned her pain into purpose, her silence into testimony, her cage into a map for others to find their way out. They punished me for questioning a Watchtower article. They tried to break me with shame and isolation. They wanted me to believe that thinking was dangerous, that doubt was sin, that obedience was love. But they were wrong. My questions didn't destroy me. They saved me. And in saving myself, I helped save others. That's not apostasy. That's redemption. This is my testimony. This is my truth. And I'm no longer afraid to speak it.